What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, you know what time it is. It is the wide receiver starts and sits. We are going to go matchup by matchup and let you know how we overall feel about each wide receiver on that team. By the end of this video, you should have a good understanding of how we overall rank these players. So this should help you in making your start and sit decisions. But if you do have a very close pair of receivers that you are not sure who to start, the best course of action would be to refer to our rankings. Those are available on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website not only gain access to the weekly rankings, you get our trade targets for each week, ordered waiver priority, fab suggestion for those waiver ads, air yard trade model results, droppable player list, and more. So if that interests you, go to our website, sign up, and become a member today. With that out of the way though, let's hop into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was among running backs with at least 10 carries in week 1. Aaron Jones faced the highest percentage of 8+ defenders in the box. Which running back faced 8+ defenders at the second highest rate? The correct answer was Cam Akers. Congratulations to My, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, we're keeping it simple. Which quarterback in week 1 had the longest completed air distance? So this is going to be a deep target. So which quarterback did complete the furthest target? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that out of the way though, let's hop right into the first matchup. It's a divisional game. We have Cincinnati at Cleveland. The Cleveland Browns, they are actually massive favorites in this game, a little bit higher than I would have expected, coming in at 8.5 points. The projected total for this game is coming in at 46, so definitely heavily favored in the side of Cleveland. What that means is if that does hold true, the overall passing volume on the Cleveland side of the ball, it may not be all that high. That's ideally not what we would want to hear when it comes to Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, two players that honestly disappointed us based on their ADP last week. That didn't come as too much of a surprise though. It was a bad matchup and this one is much more favorable, but when you consider the fact that they aren't projected to be playing from behind for the majority of the game like they did in week 1, ultimately the passing volume may not be there from the second half. With that being said though, we still think you can fit them into your lineup. Odell Beckham coming in just under the top 20 at the wide receiver position, so a back-end wide receiver 2. Jarvis Landry, a back-end wide receiver 3, somebody you would ideally rather put in your flex position. As for the Cincinnati side of the ball, we'll start with AJ Green. Heading into last week, we knew that AJ Green was coming off of an injury he sustained during training camp. This made him somewhat of a risky start. You didn't draft him in a spot where you felt forced to put him into your lineup, so preferably we would have liked to leave him on the bench, and the limitation of snaps actually held true. He only played on about 66% of snaps. Compare that to Tyler Boyd's 81%, and John Ross, the quiet leader in snap percentage, came in at a whopping 84%. With Green not noted as suffering any setbacks, we could expect his overall snaps to increase from here, and even though the snap percentage for Green is lower than we should expect from this point on in the season, he was still pretty productive. He did see a decent amount of volume, 9 targets to be specific, which is definitely respectable for a receiver with 66% of snaps. So considering they are underdogs, indicating a more pass-heavy game script, he was already receiving near double-digit targets on a mere 66% of snaps. There's a solid amount of upside for Green this week. We still would feel more comfortable only starting him as a wide receiver 3 or a flex player just until he gets his footing underneath him, but he is still ranked ahead of Tyler Boyd, another player we would have in flex consideration, but Boyd is ranked just outside the top 30, a starter nonetheless, but nobody else in this matchup we're considering starting. The next matchup we have is Detroit at Green Bay, also a 46-point over-under. Green Bay is currently a favorite by 6.5 points. Very positive news for the pass catchers for Detroit. Kenny Golladay was a healthy scratch for week 1. We don't have him projected to make it into the lineup this week, and if that is the case, that is positive news for Marvin Jones, who did disappoint in what should have been a high upside matchup for him. But once again, this is still a boom bust wide receiver, as he has been for several years now. With no Kenny Golladay though, he will see a uptick in overall usage, which does increase the odds that he does pop off, but we can't be all that disappointed if he produces like he did in week 1. As for rookie Quintez Cephus, he stepped in and seemed to be the primary pass catcher filling the role for Kenny Golladay. While he could be worth a speculative add, there's no reason to fit him into your lineup. And just a PSA for all of you out there, if there is a receiver who did have a good week 1 but he wasn't drafted or he was added off of the waiver wire, we may not mention him because at week 2 this is not the time you want to be overreacting to one performance. If we go ahead and just take all of the players that are off of the waiver wire that performed well in week 1, insert them into our lineup, most of those players are likely to disappoint and unlikely to replicate what they did. So at this point in the season, stick to your studs is the best method. That will hold true for Quintez Cephas. I know Danny Amendola is also a player who stepped up, but even in a PPR league, you would have to be in a very deep league in order to consider starting him. On the Green Bay side of the ball, Devontae Adams, no other receiver. Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Allen Lazard are battling for that wide receiver 2 position. Marquez Valdes-Scantling did have a drop, but in the next few weeks, we could have a better understanding of which player is going to receive what amount of volume. But until that happens, we can't recommend starting either of them. Moving into the next matchup, though, we have the New York Giants versus Chicago. Chicago is coming in at a 5-point favorite, and we saw in the first matchup of New York Giants versus the Pittsburgh Steelers that promoted a very pass-heavy game script for them. The main beneficiary was, of course, Darius Slayton, somebody I have been pretty high on throughout this offseason, but I did not expect him to perform well in week 1. And while I wouldn't be all that surprised if he does have a good game, I'm still not convinced enough in order to put him in my lineup over those guys I drafted ahead of him. We do have him ranked just outside the top 36, so if you are in a league that starts multiple wide receivers and a flex, starting him in your flex could be a choice that pays off. He is the highest ranked wide receiver of the New York Giants, which should indicate to you we're not starting any other receiver. For Chicago, Allen Robinson, somewhat disappointed he didn't score. He did, however, lead the team in targets. Anthony Miller did have the better game. A long touchdown did save his game. Likely he was riding on your bench, a spot he should still stay in for this upcoming week. But Allen Robinson, he should be an auto lock, so get him into your lineup. This should still be a positive matchup for him against a very weak pass defense of the New York Giants. The next matchup we have is Jacksonville versus Tennessee. The Jaguars are coming in as massive underdogs, a whopping 11 points. And while I do think that is a bit aggressive, this should once again be a very pass-friendly game for the Jacksonville Jaguars. If they're down by nearly 2 scores, that just screams garbage time. People may be a bit weary because DJ Chark did finish 3rd in the pecking order when it came to targets. He only had 3 on the day. No wide receiver you're starting as your wide receiver 2. You should feel comfortable getting a mere 3 targets. But on a positive note, he did lead all receivers in snaps. He is the clear top receiving option for this team. And as he just proved in week 1, he's not the type of player to require a high amount of volume in order to perform. But it's a virtual lock that he is going to increase the overall volume over what he saw in week 1. We have DJ Chark ranked as the wide receiver 15 this week. We would not be all that surprised if he does outproduce that. So if you are a Chark owner, fit him in your lineup. You should be rewarded. No other Jacksonville receiver we should feel confident enough to fit in our lineup this week, even in a positive matchup. So we're going to hop over to Tennessee. We start with AJ Brown. A big disappointment in week 1. Corey Davis, despite receiving the same amount of volume as AJ Brown, he did outperform him. This was cause and effect from simply exploiting a matchup, so we can't guarantee it translates week over week. For that reason, I cannot suggest starting Corey Davis. Definitely worth an add. He is a first-round talent, but one that has disappointed us all for several seasons. Heading into this week, though, we do have to rank AJ Brown accordingly. Considering the Jacksonville Jaguars defense is extremely poor, there is a bit of upside for AJ Brown this week to potentially push for wide receiver 1 numbers. We do know that the floor for him is pretty low, but a high-end wide receiver 2 is where we have him listed for this week. The next matchup we have is Atlanta at Dallas. Dallas is 7.5-point favorites in this matchup. This game is coming in at one of the highest over-unders of the entire week at 50 points. And we saw last week with Seattle also projected to be a high matchup against Atlanta. It did not disappoint for all of the wide receivers involved. Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones, premier starts at the position, both wide receiver 1s. Calvin Ridley, a more mid to back end wide receiver 1. Julio Jones, we're expecting big things from him. He is ranked as the wide receiver 2 this week. As for the receivers on the Dallas side of the ball, Amari Cooper had a whopping 14 targets last week. The next closest receiver was CeeDee Lamb coming in with 6. Michael Gallup had 5. So if this week's matchup and the target distribution looks anything like we saw in week 1, Amari Cooper could be in line for a massive game. We have him ranked inside of the top 10. As for CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup, despite Michael Gallup being out-targeted by CeeDee Lamb, we still have Gallup ranked significantly ahead of CeeDee Lamb. Michael Gallup is coming in at the wide receiver 24. CeeDee Lamb just inside the top 30, Both players we would like to start. They have a bunch of upside in a game that could shoot out. So if you have any of these players, there is always the chance that they could have that week winning type of upside. That's what we want to see in our flex players, and that's exactly what they have. The next game we have is San Francisco versus the New York Jets. San Francisco coming off of an upset loss by the Arizona Cardinals. They will be looking to get a win here, and they are heavy favorites as well. The New York Jets just coming off of a heart-wrenching defeat by the Buffalo Bills, but despite the San Francisco 49ers coming off of a Super Bowl appearance, they're only 4-point favorites on the road against the New York Jets, which should keep the passing volume in line for both teams throughout the entire game. We still cannot recommend to start any San Francisco receiver. The volume is likely going to come from the backfield of this offense, and with Debo going to IR, George Kittle questionable to make an appearance in this game. Brandon Ayuk has the possibility to suit up, but there is a realistic outcome where Kendrick Bourne is leading the receivers on this team. That is a situation I would like to avoid, even though it's against a very beatable pass defense in the Jets, but we are not recommending starting any receivers on this team. As for the Jets, you have Jamison Crowder coming off of a monster performance. Most of you, if you drafted him, he was probably sitting on your bench, so I could see you motivated to fit him in the lineup, especially after seeing San Francisco get exposed. But once again, we can't overreact. San Francisco is a much better defense than what we saw against Arizona, so that should render Crowder the only startable asset on this team at the receiver position to nothing more than a high floor flex play. The next matchup we have is the Philadelphia Eagles, a home game against the LA Rams. The LA Rams are 3-point underdogs in this matchup. Both of the receivers for the LA Rams, they have a bunch of upside in this game. The Eagles secondary, despite signing Darius Slay, they still can get exposed pretty easily. Their subpar offensive line against Aaron Donald may overall lead to more offensive snaps for the LA Rams. More offensive snaps, that's going to result in more passing volume. Cooper Kupp, however, did get off to a slow start in week 1. A strong candidate to bounce back. We do, however, have Robert Woods leading this team when it comes to ranking. Robert Woods, a wide receiver 1 this week. Cooper Kupp, a high-end wide receiver 2. Two players you definitely want to get in your lineup, but you are probably never considering benching them. As for the Eagles, this was a very confusing game. Nobody expected them to get destroyed exactly how badly they did, especially with a heavy lead in the early part of the game. But when looking at the wide receiver usage and snap counts, it only gets more confusing. It's starting to appear that the only players we can trust from a passing standpoint are the tight ends, Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz. So the ideal choice is to leave both Deshaun Jackson and Jalen Reagor on the bench. If we were forced to choose to start one, Deshaun Jackson would certainly be the play over Reagor. Reagor did outsnap Deshaun Jackson, and when head coach Doug Peterson was asked the reason why Deshaun Jackson only saw 59% of snaps in week 1 in a game in which they had to come back from behind, his answer was to just keep Deshaun Jackson healthy for the long run, and he also noted that Deshaun Jackson's snaps should also increase week over week. Considering he mentioned that there will be a several week process for that to happen, we can't expect a massive jump in his overall snap percentage, so starting him is very risky. As we know with Djax though, it comes with a significant amount of upside, but still it's a play we would like to avoid. Jalen Reagor, send him to the bench. Moving on over, we have Carolina Panthers versus Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay 8.5-point favorites against a very beatable pass defense of the Carolina Panthers. Tampa Bay 8.5-point favorites against a very beatable pass defense. Tom Brady really didn't look all that great in week 1, but it's to be expected. There was a shortened offseason. It's a new team, new offense. We did fully expect heading into week 1 that there were going to be some kinks to work out. Regardless, we are still very high on Chris Godwin. He finished week 1 with 7 targets, Scotty Miller right behind him with 6. Certainly a player worth a speculative add, but not one you want to fit in the lineup. Mike Evans, a bit concerning, only receiving 4 targets, but we know he did suffer an injury. We were not sure if he was going to even play, but we can't 100% use it as an excuse because he played on over 90% of snaps. We certainly expect the chemistry between him and Brady to improve as the season goes on, and we are not by any means saying to put him on the bench. We have him ranked as a mid-grade wide receiver too, but just set your expectations because if he doesn't receive the volume, his range of outcomes could be very wide. As for Carolina, DJ Moore did lead this team when it came to snap percentage, but Robbie Anderson really stole the show when it came to a production standpoint. There's no way we are ever sitting DJ Moore. even after a mediocre performance, but I would also be hesitant to try and fit Robbie Anderson in the lineup because it's also the same situation of potentially chasing fantasy points. We know Robbie Anderson has had success on his previous team, and deep play receivers like Anderson, it only takes one play to save a fantasy day, so it's not overly impossible for him to have a good game this week once again. But until we see consistent targets coming from Teddy Bridgewater over to Anderson, we can't feel all that comfortable fitting him into our lineups. We aren't starting Curtis Samuel, and we are expecting a bounce back for DJ Moore, the target leader in this offense. We do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1, and in this matchup, he certainly has the potential to exceed that. Up next, Denver versus Pittsburgh. Starting with Pittsburgh, who are the home favorites, 7.5 points to be exact. We are once again expecting a solid performance from Juju Smith-Schuster. He had a very strong performance against the New York Giants, even in a game where they were also heavy favorites. So we are not all that concerned with the potential for a lack of volume when it comes to what we can expect for Juju. But it may come as a surprise for you to hear that Deontay Johnson actually led this team in targets. The amount of targets he received was near the top of the league, double digits. And despite getting off to a rocky start, he really pulled it together and showed us a lot of promise for the potential future for his fantasy production. As for this upcoming week, we can't suggest to start him anything earlier than a flex, but that's massively ahead of James Washington, who we rank clearly as the third option in this offense. We can't recommend starting him, but over to Denver, we currently have Courtland Sutton in the rankings, but we do have him outside of the top 30 once we get more information on the nature of his injury, his status for playing, how much time he will be on the field. We will adjust the rankings accordingly. He is the only Denver wide receiver we would consider starting. If he's out, you could take a shot on a player like Jerry Jeudy, but it didn't bring in a ton of upside in last week's matchup. This one could be arguably more difficult, but he did drop a couple of passes which would have changed the overall outlook we had on his day and his performance against Tennessee. This ranking and his flex consideration is reliant on the health of Courtland Sutton. We would like to have Jerry Jeudy as the leader when it comes to targets. If he's not, he likely won't have the upside we're looking for when it comes to a flex player, not against this defense. So if that is the case, leave him on the bench. Moving over to Minnesota versus Indianapolis. This has a 47-point over-under. Minnesota rode underdogs by about 3 points, so this indicates a pretty even game script. As we know, Minnesota prefers to run the ball, even in what was a shootout against Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. There was not a whole lot of passing volume to go around. On a positive note though, Adam Thielen, the clear target leader in this offense, he had 8 targets. Compare that to the next closest receiver we have, Johnson, who ended up receiving a mere half of the targets, coming in at 4. Justin Jefferson coming in at 3. So this is a very positive sign for Adam Thielen, exactly as expected heading into the season. The only major concern for Thielen is going to come down to volume. While 8 targets, if sustained throughout an entire season, is enough to produce, it's unlikely that the Minnesota Vikings are going to be in games like they were against Green Bay, in which they will be forced to pass the ball as often. In those games, the floor for Adam Thielen may be lower, and that's potentially what we could see this week. He is still a must-start receiver, a mid-grade wide receiver 1 in this matchup, but we're not starting anyone outside of him. On the other side of the ball, T.Y. Hilton, he's the only one we can realistically consider. Phillip Rivers, he had his struggles. Once again, these new quarterbacks, new offenses, this is to be expected. No preseason, shortened training camp. The connection between Hilton and Rivers, it's going to increase as the weeks go on. He received 9 targets in week 1. That was good to tie receiver Paris Campbell, who despite getting a hefty target market share, it's not a player we can recommend starting. Moving over to Buffalo at Miami, I really like this game. Buffalo is on the road, but still 3-point favorites. It was a very promising sign what we saw from the receivers. We had John Brown with 10 targets, Stephon Diggs with 9, and Cole Beasley right behind him coming in with 7. These are the clear receivers that are going to be heavily targeted by Josh Allen. Stephon Diggs, despite coming up short by 1 target to match John Brown, he is the likely favorite to lead this team from a receiving standpoint. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2, one with plenty of upside this week. And as for John Brown, while we cannot guarantee he will receive double-digit targets once again, he is still worthy of a flex. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 3, definitely a player that could exceed our expectations, but one that we know has a pretty small floor. Cole Beasley, though, we really don't have to go there. Moving over to Washington versus Arizona. Washington on the road, 7-point underdogs. This is an extremely positive situation for Terry McLaurin, who, based on draft capital, probably disappointed you if you drafted him. From what we saw of this Arizona Cardinals offense, the Washington Redskins are going to be forced to pass the ball quite a bit, so the volume overall for McLaurin, it's likely to increase as well. McLaurin finished the game with 7 targets. Behind him, we had Dontrell Inman with 5. No need to go there or for any other receiver in this offense. Dwayne Haskins, not the type of quarterback to be able to support multiple fantasy wide receivers. So McLaurin's the guy. This week in a very positive matchup, we have McLaurin ranked as a top-end wide receiver 2. So if you were disappointed by his production in week 1, feel good and know that we are confident in him bouncing back this week. On the Arizona side of the ball, DeAndre Hopkins, really the only guy we can trust at this point. He really popped off his first game on a new offense. Very, very impressive. He ranked just behind Devontae Adams with 16 targets. Adams had 17, so these are easily elite wide receivers. The concerns we had with the potential target market share of Hopkins, that's out the window. Despite what we saw last season, it's clear they are going to get Hopkins involved. They paid for him, they wanted him, and they are using him exactly as he should be used. It resulted in a win, so why steer away from that? So Hopkins, he is in line for another great performance, and for us, we have him ranked as the wide receiver 3. Kansas City Chiefs versus the LA Chargers. The Kansas City Chiefs are currently coming in as 5.5-point favorites. They are expecting the LA Chargers to score themselves, more so than we saw last week. A disappointing performance for most of the offensive weapons if you drafted them. Mike Williams, he did exceed what we expected, but most people, they weren't starting him. We wouldn't recommend to start him in this matchup if you can avoid it, but if he has another good game, if he appears to be a solid target for Tyrod Taylor once again, Mike Williams will certainly become a player we consider potentially putting into our lineups. As for Keenan Allen, unfortunately, the volume that we had come to expect when Phillip Rivers was leading this team, it didn't translate from Tyrod Taylor. As we know, Keenan Allen is very reliant on that volume, so if the volume goes away, Keenan Allen's production is not going to be where we want it. We aren't totally condemning him and saying that he's going to be a bust for the entire season. Tyrod overall had a very poor game. That's not to say that better games are not in his future, so we will give him a chance, but we do have to bump down Keenan Allen. A player who was a back-end wide receiver 2 is now a mid-grade wide receiver 3, and that safe floor, it should still be there in this positive matchup, but we still have to temper our expectations. On the Kansas City side, we have Sammy Watkins coming off of a massive performance, a true week 1 warrior, but despite that, we're not looking to catch lightning in a bottle and trying to chase the points on our bench, put him into our lineup, because from what we have seen from Sammy Watkins on the Kansas City Chiefs, he has had these big blow-up games. He has also proceeded to post duds. The majority of his games have been duds, and while he does have the ability to potentially produce in back-to-back weeks, from what we have seen in seasons past, we just can't guarantee it. For that, he is nothing more than a flex play against this solid defense. Tyreek Hill, of course, an auto start. Definitely a player who can get behind this solid secondary. Always a threat to score. We have him as a mid to high grade wide receiver 1. No other wide receiver on the Kansas City Chiefs were interested in putting into our lineups. So we'll move into the next matchup. The Baltimore Ravens versus the Houston Texans. This game has the highest projected total of the entire week, coming in at a whopping 54.5 points. Baltimore Ravens favored by 6. A positive note for the receivers on Houston. Unfortunately, it is not a positive matchup though, so thrusting them into your lineups, even Will Fuller, who is coming off of a very solid game backed by a heavy amount of volume, it's going to present some risk, but from what we saw from him in week 1, we've seen this is the type of player you want to try to fit in. If you can get him into your flex, he provides a ton of upside. We've seen him have these multi-TD games. Whenever Will Fuller is able to get double-digit digit targets. What we saw from him could even be on the low end of our expectations. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3, one that could certainly disappoint, but definitely one with week winning upside. As for Brandon Cooks, he posted a dud. While typically we have seen him transition teams flawlessly, it looked as if the connection and chemistry with Deshaun Watson wasn't quite there yet. We could chop it up to a shortened offseason, but we'd like to see 1 or 2 more games of Brandon Cooks to get an idea of how he is used in this offense, and hopefully he improves. Until then, gotta leave him on the bench. On the other side of the ball, Marquise Brown, we feel confident you can safely start him as a back-end wide receiver too. We saw his involvement heavily increase from what we saw in his rookie season. Last year he was playing with metal in his foot, so it's to be expected, but even with that being the case, he exceeded our expectations. He is the clear leader at the wide receiver position, and one that even if my team is deep, I'm trying to get in my lineup because he has that upside that could be the difference between a win and a loss. Only 2 more matches remain. The Sunday night game is going to be New England on the road against Seattle. A very interesting matchup. Seattle coming off of a massive passing performance on the back of Russell Wilson, but unlike that matchup with Atlanta, this game has a much lower projected total. From what we saw from New England, they didn't have a ton of success moving the ball downfield. That's not to say that that will continue in this matchup, but we're not expecting a shootout. We can still safely say that Tyler Lockett should make it into all of your lineups as a back-end wide receiver 2. Him and DK Metcalf both led this team in targets, coming in with 8 apiece. DK, not his best game. He did make up for it with the touchdown, of course, but he certainly left some fantasy points on the field. Regardless, these players are very similarly ranked. Tyler Lockett just a few spots ahead of him, so if you own them, you're getting them in there. We're not starting any other Seattle receiver. The only New England receiver in consideration is Julian Edelman. Edelman was a player we were a bit higher on last week. He didn't disappoint if you started him, but we didn't see a ton of upside. He led this team from a receiving standpoint, but it's clear without Brady, there is going to be somewhat of a drop-off. 7 targets each and every week for a player like Julian Edelman who requires volume in order to get it done. It's just not going to be enough to give you that upside or the safety that we're really looking for. Regardless though, you can put him in as a high floor flex play, but considering he is not known to score touchdowns and he gets most of his work done through receptions and yardage, he may be lacking the upside you need if you're facing a tougher opponent. As for N'Keal Harry, he came in just 1 target shy of Edelman, which is very promising for his potential involvement as the season goes on. But again, a very similar situation. 6 targets, not going to get it done. So for us, we're leaving him on the bench. Take a wait and see approach with him. And we're going to head into our final matchup. The Monday night game, we have the New Orleans Saints versus the Las Vegas Raiders. This game has a 50.5 over under. The Raiders defense, as we saw, not very good. Even the Carolina Panthers offense under Teddy Bridgewater, they were able to get exploited. Imagine what Drew Brees can do coming off of a subpar performance and some heavy criticism. The only downside, of course, for Brees and the New Orleans Saints is that we can't really expect Michael Thomas to suit up. The information we have on his injury is currently limited, but from what we know, this is an injury that could potentially hold him out for some significant time. If that does happen, Emmanuel Sanders is going to be a solid play. While he is old, he is certainly the most talented receiver on this team. So if you own him and Michael Thomas is out, try to get him in as a high-end wide receiver 3, back-end wide receiver 2, or possibly somebody you could put in as a high upside flex. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 25, certainly a player with a massive amount of upside, but his first year on this new offense, it's going to be a mixed bag. This weak defense of the Las Vegas Raiders could certainly bring him to a bounce back, but with the lack of weapons, it's not a guarantee. Regardless, Emmanuel Sanders still a solid start. On the other side of the ball, we have Henry Ruggs, who was taken out with an injury after having a pretty solid start to the season. Unfortunately, a leg injury, it did take him out of the game for a short period of time. That did hinder his overall volume, but he did still lead this team in targets. Very promising, especially considering this team is lacking weapons for the receiver position. He did enough to get me to notice. Unfortunately, though, that's not going to warrant a start, especially if he's not 100% healthy. The New Orleans Saints defense, it's not as bad as it gets a rap for. So the upside, the floor, it's not really there, but he is certainly a player we want to keep an eye on. No other Raiders receiver we would even consider starting. So that's going to do it, guys. We just went through every matchup of week 2, let you know how we feel about all of the wide receivers. receivers. If you did enjoy this video, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.